last week was about the Sheish Sechiros and the fact that in many Sephardic Sidurim there are 10. I just want to go over something here. The idea that you have to mention the 6 remembrances comes from the Mekubalim, largely the Arizal and then the Chidah. And the 6 that are in the Siddur, the 6 are remember Mitzrayim, it's Yitzchak every day. Remember you stood at Har Sinai. Remember the evil of Amalek. Remember the sin of the Egel. Remember Miriam and the sin of Lashon Hara. And remember Shabbos. Now in all of these cases the Torah said the word remember, remember, remember. So that's why we remember, we say them. Now the Sephardim add 4 altogether. And as I looked at it more carefully, I have an answer for why we don't include, Ashkenazim don't include 2, but 2 others are at Tzarich Ian. The 4 they add is a pasuk that says, remember what you went through in the desert when Hashem gave you the man. That's one that they add. Then they add a general pasuk, remember that it is God who nosein lecha koach, He gave you the power. Lasos chayil. That's number 2. Number 3 is a pasuk in Micha. Micha, remember what Bilam tried to do to you and Hashem saved you. And the last one they add is, do not forget Yerushalayim. Im eshkirei Yerushalayim, I should forget my right hand. Now, I understand, I can give you a good answer, I think, why Ashkenazim don't put in those last 2, because they only put in Zechiros in the Torah. And the last 2, one is from Micha, that's the one about Bilam, and one is in Tehillim, so that's not included. But I actually don't have, I don't remember everything I said yesterday, I actually don't have a good answer why Ashkenazim don't include the man, which is in Torah, and don't include the pasuk, hu nosein lecha koach lasos chayil. So I can answer why we don't have 10, but I'm not sure why we don't have 8. 2 of them we should answer. Okay, so it's a good question. Now the other thing I want to talk about it's a little uncomfortable for me. You know, I often talk about hate mail, and maybe I shouldn't use this as the forum to air, my hurts. But this is the second time it happened, and I want to tell you this. I received over the past few months 2 very long letters and continuing correspondence about the long letters that somehow it is very, very inappropriate for me to push on Baalei Tshuva that they should move to Israel. They say that, I'm destroying people's lives, I'm taking advantage of my position. When I live here on American money and, I'm doing real comfortable and I didn't come to Israel till I was 56, what gives me the right to talk about, young people who would sacrifice their careers and suffer a life of misery in Israel, which is like, I'm not even exaggerating, and which would therefore condemn them to misery because of my idealism, which I did not take advantage of till I was in retirement. I don't really notice that I'm retired. So, again, I really apologize for spending time, but I want to make a few points that I think are relevant to the Q&A. And that is, number 1, I have absolutely never pushed anyone to move to Israel. And in fact, when people meet with me, there are people I tell them not to move to Israel. What I said exactly was that every religious Jew is obligated to ask themselves the question, why am I not in Israel? You can have a very good answer why you're not in Israel. And that answer I would respect and halacha would respect. A person might say the parnasa is too hard. A person might say the lifestyle is difficult. A person might say the Haredi world is too polarized. Those are legitimate answers as they apply to your situation. I have never said, publicly or privately, everybody must move to Israel. I have said, and I will say, that you have to have a reason not to move to Israel. And, there are reasons. But to simply ignore it and simply say that after Hashem gave us Eretz Yisrael, we don't even have to think about it, I think is not the Ratzon Hashem. Okay, so I just want to be clear, and I thought I was clear. I don't understand. I really don't understand this. That I am not giving you oh yes, he gave me a whole drasha about Rav Soloveitchik would never tell a person what to do. He would always explore the issues. Wow, great insight. I tell you what to do. So the thing is, I am not giving an answer. I am simply saying you must ask yourself the question. Okay, I thought it was absolutely clear. Apparently it is not. And it is an important question, because if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us the ability to come back to Eretz Yisrael, then we have to ask ourselves, why not? Yeah, and there may be a good answer. Eino chinami, okay? So forgive me for being a little upset over this, but I am upset. The tone of the letters is okay, whatever. It's very condescending. I mean, the person gave me a drasha. To talk to Bali Tshuva takes special training and sensitivity. So perhaps, you shouldn't be the okay, whatever, okay. But I hope everyone gets the point if they didn't get the point. Ask the question, talk to your rabbeim, talk to your spiritual advisors, look at your family situation, look at your finances, but don't ignore it. You can't ignore Eretz Yisrael. And to tell you the truth, this hate mail is not only hate mail to me, I think it is hate mail to Eretz Yisrael. And this is ke'ein the chet hameraglim mamish. It's one thing to say that I'm not ready for Aliyah, it's not the right thing for me right now. It's another thing to say, how dare you bring it up as something to consider. It frankly is absolutely astounding. Okay, I had to vent, but okay, any other questions for tonight? Yeah.
When a person has struggles in his avodas Hashem, how does he determine whether or not that struggle is something which is more like a therapy thing which he needs to work on emotionally, or just his Yitzhak and he needs to work on it with sifrei mussar? Let's say that he has an anger problem. Is that anger problem?
An anger problem, yeah.
Just an example. How does he know that he needs to be kind to himself and he needs self-care and he needs to work on his self-love, or which would be more of like an emotional therapy approach, or he needs to be hard on himself and he has to work harder and learn more and things like that?
Yeah, this is actually a very important issue that has become more and more relevant as the mental health community has grown and as more and more religious Jews are going to therapists, are going to psychologists, going to social workers, and the like. And the question becomes, in the olden days, if I had some personality problem, again, your example, I was angry, I was selfish, I was depressed. So we talked about mussar and Torah learning and chizuk and spiritually building yourself up. And now we say, go to a therapist, either for therapy or go to a psychiatrist for medication. And the question becomes, when do you look at your struggles? I'm just repeating your question. When do you look at your struggles as spiritual questions that I have to struggle with? And when do you simply say, it's kind of a medical issue or a psychological issue and the like? It's very, very hard to answer that, but I think the answer in short would be that these are not contradictory modalities. I think you have to work on both of them at the same time. You have to work on your spiritual chizuk, learning mussar, learning Torah, strengthening yourself. And at the same time, you need to explore the psychological aspects of things. Now, in fact, not only are these not contradictory, but if you look at mussar, in fact, this was the Chazon Ish's part of his criticism of mussar, mussar itself, when it's studied in a deep way, is about understanding yourself. It is about psychology. See, we make a big mistake. We actually mischaracterize what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter did. We think when Rabbi Yisrael Salanter started this idea of learning mussar, we think that just meant you pull out a Mesilas Yesharim and you learn it for half an hour a day or whatever it is. The truth is that's only a small part of what the mussar movement was about. Unfortunately, it's the main part that survived, but there was so much more. It was about group therapy sessions, not with the psychologist, but you would discuss your struggles with other people, and each would give chizuk to the other. It was about self-understanding. It was about, why do I behave a certain way? So in many, many ways, there actually is a tremendous overlap between psychology and mussar. So both can be worked on at the same time, provided you get a therapist who's, if not from, I think which would be optimal, at least is respectful and understanding of your values. This is one of the reasons, it's a complicated thing, one of the reasons the Chazon Ish was a little worried about mussar was precisely because Mussar was so into psychology, it was not always using exclusively Jewish sources. That was Gufa the Chazon Ish's issue. On the other hand, Rav Wolbe, I've mentioned this before, when Rav Wolbe was a young man, he actually apprenticed himself. He was in Switzerland during part of World War II, which was neutral. He apprenticed himself to Jean Piaget. Now, those of you that took psychology courses in college know that Jean Piaget was a world-renowned, non-Jewish child, I think a psychiatrist, I'm not sure, psychologist or psychiatrist, and he wrote a lot about how children develop morality. And Rav Wolbe held it was kedai for him, as a Bal Mussar, to try to understand the psychological processes of growth. And he said that even though Piaget was a goy, this is nichlal in chachma bagayim tamen, right? So it is legitimate within a Mussar framework. Also, many of you may have come across the very beautiful Sfarim by, used to be anonymous, now we know who he is, Rabbi Somer Schwartz. That's the series of Sfarim that are called the Bilvavi Mishkan Evnech. It's also in English, how to build a relationship with Hashem. Bilvavi. It started off as one book and now many, many books and websites and everything else. But he wrote a parallel series. So Bilvavi is how to make a relationship with Hashem, a personal relationship. And he wrote a parallel series called daas atzmecha, know yourself, because he basically says you can't really have a relationship with Hashem until you know who you are. And he actually said most people will want to do the Bilvavi stuff because I want to be connected to Hashem, but in reality, you need to understand yourself. So that's where I think psychology and therapy could be very, very helpful, because you then understand yourself, and then you can take the mussar and work on yourself. So it's a very, very good question, but I think there is room in life for both things to work at the same time. Yeah.
There was an interesting case in Michigan that ended yesterday. Maybe you've heard of it. There was a school shooting about 2 years ago by a pretty sick boy, and the parents got charged with involuntary manslaughter, which holds them responsible for the murders. Usually they get charged with some sort of negligence, but this time they're holding them accountable for the murder. It's probably political to go after gun owners, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, in halacha, how much trouble would a parent be in? The background is that they knew the kid was crazy. They bought him a gun on Xmas. That January he went and shot up the school, and they didn't tell the school. Yeah, so let me just remind you of a case in the Gemara itself. The Gemara says, if I entrust fire to a cheresh shaita v'katan, to a mentally incompetent person, or a katan, a kid with low bar mitzvah, and they destroy something, so I, as a parent, or as whoever gave it to the kid, is chayav in God's law. I'm chayav b'dinei shamayim. But a beis din cannot punish me because I didn't do it. That's why the Gemara actually says, don't mess with the katan, because if a katan hurts you, you have nobody to go after. I can't go after the katan, and I can't go after the parents. Halacha does not at all accept bidei adam that parents are liable for things their kids do, even if the parents are negligent. But b'dinei shamayim, if they're negligent, Hashem will hold them accountable. But a human beis din would not be able to be mechayev them. And even if the kids are above bar mitzvah, and the parents told them, in other words, if I tell somebody to kill, that's ein shaliach b'dvar avera. There's no shalichus for sin, so it's only the sinner that's chayev, not the guy that hired the hitman. So now, what's interesting is this. So if you're asking me from a pure halachic standpoint, would there be parental liability for manslaughter? The answer is no. But you could ask the following questions. There are a few questions you could ask. Well, that's under Jewish law. But would things be different under the Noachite law? Because if you're talking about non-Jewish societies are not necessarily going to be governed by halacha. Non-Jewish societies are going to be, they're governed by halacha, but not Jewish halacha. They're governed by the halacha of the 7 commandments of Noach. So here it would appear the following. The Torah gives, or the halachic system, gives authority to non-Jewish communities, general communities, to impose liability beyond what halacha would say. So it would be a permissible extension under the Noachide law, although it would not be a mandatory extension. So in a sense, that makes it a political question. In other words, if you're asking me, could the state impose liability on a parent, the answer is yes. Must it impose liability on the parent? The answer is no. So between a could and a must, is goofa going to be the debate in society? Should. So I think it would be left to the political process. Again, people are surprised whenever the answer in Judaism is it's left to the political process. But in point of fact, there are issues, particularly under the Noachide Code, that are left to society to determine based on what they consider to be just. Now, in truth, some amount of liability, whether it's manslaughter or negligence, it's a separate issue, I think is very, very warranted. And the very fact that in halacha the parent is chayav b'dinei shamayim does tell me that the parents did something very, very wrong. So for the Noachites to then translate it into some liability or sanction, I think is a relatively reasonable step to take. Yeah.
I had a question about tashchis.
Yeah.
I need to show the Rav though.
Okay.
These are for the Rav. They're Pereg lentils. They're absolutely beautiful.
Oh.
And they're Badatz Mahadrin.
Okay.
I was thinking, since they're so beautiful, I'll make art out of them or something. And I was wondering if that's Bal Tashchis.
Yeah, about tashchis. So I'll tell you, I had a related question when my son was growing up, that they drew pictures in like second or third grade, and they surrounded it with like dried macaroni, colored macaroni. And, we just left it around. Then I realized in the middle of Pesach, we got this picture here with dried macaroni, so you got to be careful. Lentils, okay, kitniya, sorry, not so bad. You're allowed to have kitniya, and Sfardim can eat it, and Ashkenazim can have it, so at least with this, there wouldn't be a problem. So the question is it Bal Tashchis to use edible food items? That's the question, to use an edible food item in an artistic situation. Now, once again, if the pshat is you could then remove it and eat it, that's fine. I'm assuming your question is that you're going to be rendering it inedible. I think there is an issue. There is an issue that even though it's not purely destructive, it's constructive, but it's constructive in terms of the secondary use and not the primary intended use. An example might be that sometimes some people are machmir, they will not feed, depends how you feed your dog, they will not feed an animal food that is fit for human consumption. Because they'll say human food should go to humans and animal food goes to animals, and it's a form of destruction. Now, even if you're mako, that's because it's still the idea of eating. But when you're totally changing it from its normal intended use, some would say that that is called hashchasa. Now, I want to bring you maybe a contrary ruling, which may indicate the other way around. In the time of Chazal, and really in the time of the Tanakh, when people would die, like a melech would die, they used to burn his possessions as an act of homage, that nobody else should use them or whatever it would be. They would burn all sorts of things. In fact, they do it in India today, the same thing. And the discussion is that called Bal Tashchis? You're just destroying usable clothing and other things. And the answer is, it's not Bal Tashchis because it's being done as an expression of kavod for the nifter, and things that you're doing as kavod for the nifter are not called Bal Tashchis. So based on that, you could argue that I'm doing something for aesthetic, and it's not for kavod, but for aesthetic reasons. So there is that counter svara. And by the way, this has an interesting ramification in Hilchos Shabbos. One of the 39 malachos of Shabbos is to rip cloth. Rip. However, the ripping has to be constructive. It has to be kaireya, you're ripping with the purpose of sewing it up, meaning you want to make it even. If you stamazai rip, that's called makalkel, that's a destructive act. And although it's asher midrabanan, it is forbidden rabbinically, but it's not doraisa malacha unless it's done for a constructive purpose. So the Gemara says, if one rips garments because they're furious, I'm so angry, I rip it, that's called a malacha on Shabbos, like I felt walking in today. That's a malacha on Shabbos because since it reduces your anger, that's called a constructive purpose for malacha Shabbos, getting it out of your system. Okay, maybe I'll take that into account too. Okay, so there are rayas mikan mikan, meaning to say your question is not categorically forbidden, but it would be better to be machmer on it. Yeah. Yes.
Just in light of the recent situation with the controversy with autopsies, I was just
Yeah.
just get an overview of what the halacha is, and also when and if there would be a heter impact.
Yeah, this was, again, I guess everybody knows what happened. I mean, tragically, and again, we should really be thinking about the mishpacha in is Beit Shemesh or Ramat, Beit Shemesh or Ramat? Beit Shemesh itself, yeah. I mean, a boy was the day after his bar mitzvah, and the boy was a healthy boy, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him, and it's a real tragedy, and we should all be thinking the family should have nechamas and comfort and the like. I guess the boy died without chet, really. You know, became bar mitzvah and left the world, so he came to Hashem in a very good way. I don't know all the legalities of Israeli law. I mean, this is an old issue that goes back to the 1950s, where Israel was doing autopsies without permission, and the Frum community were trying to desperately stop this. I'll get to the answer to your question in a minute. And in fact, ad kedei kach, that I remember the 1970s, there were charedim, or people who would dress as orderlies or doctors with white coats, and they would actually take the dead bodies. They come into the hospital and identify themselves as doctors, and they would kidnap the corpses out of the hospital in order to get them a kavura, bury them right away without autopsy. And you know, there are stories. I mean, you know, I don't want to laugh about it, but stories, they would literally prop up a corpse. They would dress him up in clothes, and they would sit in a taxi with him, you know, and they would just tell the cab, you know, this guy's drunk, our friend is drunk, we just have to take him. Right? And you're sitting next to a dead body dressed in regular clothing. And this is ad kedei kach, that they really had to do this. Now, it's interesting that this resurfaced because as a result of all of these protests, the Israeli autopsy law was changed, and basically most of the time religious people have the right to veto autopsy. So I just don't understand the legality of this case. But let me just mention generally the halachic background. As a general rule, autopsies are absolutely usher al pi halacha, and there's a number of reasons why it's usher. Number one, it's usher because it is called nivul hames. Nivul hames is disfiguring of a corpse. You're cutting into a dead body, removing burial parts. That is called bizayon, degradation of a dead body. That is called nivul, disfigurement of a dead body. So that's one reason that it's usher. And this is a lo sasa doraisa, because the Torah says even when somebody is executed for a sin and you hang up his body for a little bit so people can see it, you have to take it down right away, because that's called a bizayon of that which is in the tselem elokim, and kal v'chomer actually cutting up. So that's one problem. The other problem is there is a chiyuv d'oraisa of kavura, of burial, every part of a body that you're able to bury, you're mechuyev to bury. So the parts of autopsies are typically not returned to the body. So there are two different problems, at least. There is nivul hames, and there is the chiyuv d'oraisa of kavura. So as a result, an autopsy is an awful thing. In addition, it is brought down in Kabbalah that the neshama itself suffers tremendously when the body is not brought to a proper kavura. This is also an issue with cremation, similar type of deal. There's a tsar to the neshama mamish. That's why I tell people all the time, they tell me, what do I do? My mother made me swear on her deathbed that I would get her cremated. How can I violate my mother's last request? And I say, always, feel free to violate your mother's last request. She will be very grateful for you in Gan Eden. You're not hurting your mom. You're actually giving your mom a lot of happiness in what you do. Now, here is the thing, though. There is a famous classic tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Cheskel Lando, the great Rav of Prague of the 1700s, where he writes, yeah, there's a very big Aveira called Nivul Hames and the like, but it's not one of the big three. It's not Avodah Zorah, Gil Arayah, Shvichus Damim. So Nivul Hames is permitted b'makom pikuach nefesh in order to save somebody's life that's in jeopardy. Right? So theoretically, autopsies are permitted if they have a potential life-saving benefit. But here's the Noda B'Yehuda's Chiddush. He says something qualifies as pikuach nefesh only if there is an existing person, a chola, lefanenu, in front of us, meaning in his day it meant in the geographical location. Today it could be worldwide, but there has to be a chola lefanenu who might benefit. Meaning, he is mechalek between an autopsy that can directly help a person in a life-threatening condition versus an autopsy that is part of long-term medical research that maybe, together with a million other autopsies, might save somebody in 20 years. It is very, very rare that an autopsy, I'll give you an example, but that an autopsy can actually be used to save a person. Now, this might be a heter for organ donation. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. Meaning organ donation, meaning the heart will go to somebody. Okay? But stam autopsies, which just yield general medical information, generally do not qualify for pikuach nefesh. And the Noda B'Yehuda points out, because if you're going to say anything that in the long term could save a life is called pikuach nefesh, then you might as well get rid of the whole Torah. I mean, imagine a medical student. You're a frum guy in medical school. So you say, well, gee, I got to drive to this lecture on Shabbos because maybe I'll hear something about preventing a heart attack that may help me 5 years from now, right? Or I got to eat this ham sandwich because if I'm too tired to hear the lecture, I'm not going to be able to save a life, right? There has to be an immediate situation here. That's called chola lefanenu. So as a result, general medical autopsies are absolutely not permitted, even if there's a potential, which is usually slight anyway, that will yield some life-saving information for the future. Now, one interesting example where autopsies might be permitted, although we would discourage it, is what is called a forensic autopsy. Let's assume, for example, that somebody died of foul play, poison, murder. And through the autopsy, we would be able to get evidence that may help to apprehend the murderer. So the poskim say, since people who murder are likely to murder again, although you can actually question that, but that's the assumption, they're like rodfim. So therefore, getting information that can get this guy off the street is called pikuach nefesh. So those types of autopsies would be permitted because they could yield concrete, even though you don't know for sure, obviously you don't know for sure, but it could yield concrete evidence that could get a dangerous person out of commission. So that would fall under the category of pikuach nefesh. And even then, even when the autopsy is permitted, there is an inyan to try to retrieve whatever body parts you can and then put them in the kever along with the rest of the person's body. So the general position of halacha is that we are very, very, very much against autopsies, more or less for the same reason we're against cremations, because it's a bizayon hames. Now, one other thing, it is important to understand something about bizayon hames. You know, the Egyptians had a whole culture that almost worshipped death. Now, people sometimes say, oh, you know, don't speak evil about the dead, meaning when the guy's alive, I could say whatever I want to say about him. When he's dead, it's sacrosanct. Judaism proceeds on the opposite premise. You have to understand something. The reason why we have so many laws about kavod for dead bodies is not because a dead body is more worthy of kavod than a live person. It's the other way around. Since the dead body is like the mantle of a Sefer Torah, since it once housed the divine soul, we must show it kavod. So kal v'chomer, how much kavod you must have for a live person. It's not that you honor the dead more than the living. It's the kavod of the dead is because it once was living. And therefore you have to learn from kavod hameis, the union of kavod habriyos, b'derech klal. So it's absolutely the opposite of the death worship of the Egyptian culture. Yeah.
So when you have this idea that people who have terrible things done to their bodies, that they're suffering from it, is there some kind of heter is not the word, but is there something that protects them in cases where you have horrible atrocities, like where all their bodies are destroyed by they did nothing wrong, but there's some malevolent force that goes after them?
I mean, obviously the Holocaust would be an outstanding example. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands. I don't know if the actual people who were cremated were millions, but many victims of the Holocaust died in the ovens, in the crematoria. Actually, they were killed first, but they were burnt in the crematoria of Auschwitz. And obviously, there's no sin there. People sometimes say, according to the strict halacha, people who are cremated, we don't sit shiva, we don't mourn. I mean, obviously, that does not apply to people who were victimized. So the question becomes, what about the spiritual suffering of the soul? It's a hard question. It could very well, it may depend on another question. The Shalah HaKadosh writes that people who die al kiddush Hashem feel no pain in their death. They only get that connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this in turn opens up a huge question whether Holocaust victims are classified as people who died al kiddush Hashem, and does it make a difference if they were religious or not religious? This is a very complicated question. Let me explain why. The typical paradigm of kiddush Hashem is when a person is given a choice. Like the goyim go over to a person and say, convert to Christianity or I'll kill you. And I'm willing to say, I am willing to die before I give up my worship of Hashem. That's called Kiddush Hashem. I am sanctifying God by saying my relationship to Hashem is more important than even my physical life. So that's Kiddush Hashem. The Crusades would be Kiddush Hashem. That would be Kiddush Hashem. The problem with the Holocaust is that there was no element of choice there, meaning to say, even if a Jew were to say, I want to become a Christian, so what? That was not relevant. In fact, there were Nebuch Jews who converted to Christianity, who died in the Holocaust. In fact, one of them is a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Edith Stein was a Carmelite nun. She was a Jewish woman who became, before World War II, a Carmelite nun. And she was deported to Auschwitz and she died. And the Catholic Church canonized her as a martyr to her faith, which is a pretty bizarre characterization. She didn't die as a martyr to Catholic. They didn't kill her because she was Catholic. They killed her because she was Jewish. So there were Jews who were religious, of course. There were Jews who were not religious. There were Jews who were Christian. But the common denominator, I don't mean really Christian, but who professed Christianity. But the common denominator was they didn't have a choice. So if you don't have a choice, where's the Kiddush Hashem in your death? Is it Kiddush Hashem, right? Is it Kiddush Hashem when you didn't have the choice of renouncing God or accepting God? So there's a big shaila here. There is l'shainais in a letter of the Rambam. It's a letter. It's not in the Mishnah Torah, and I think the lashon is a little equivocal, where the Rambam does say, or might say, that anyone who was killed because they're Jewish, definitionally is classified as Kiddush Hashem. Meaning, somebody gets killed in a car accident, that's not Kiddush Hashem, but if somebody gets killed because they're Jewish, and that would include people who were killed in terrorist attacks, people who were killed in Pittsburgh, remember what happened there. So some people are saying, some say there was a lesbian, whatever the story was, it's not important. But some people were saying that's not Kiddush Hashem because they were violating Shabbos, desecrating Shabbos. According to the Rambam, if they got singled out because they were Jewish, that qualifies as Kiddush Hashem. So that, I think, has a direct impact on your question in terms of the tsar. By the way, this issue that the neshama feels pain when the guf is mishandled, comes up with another issue as well. This is one of the bases of the halacha that you're not supposed to relocate a kever except for compelling reasons. Because it says that when a mace is moved from one kever to another kever, there is a lot of pain that the neshama feels. And that gets us into the discussion, well, what about moving a body from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael? Some will allow it. Rav Moshe was not in favor of it. Rav Moshe said once a mace is buried in Chutz La'aretz, that's where they should stay. So this notion that the neshama feels tsar when the guf is not handled properly is something that's, comes across in a number of halachic areas. Moving a mace, autopsies, cremation, all of these different things. Yeah.
Two questions. Number one, is it okay to lean a sefer on another sefer for shtender? Number two, a Kohen on Yom Tov, when he davens, when he sings, is it okay for him to put down his hands while he sings?
Yeah. So the second question is, the answer is yes. The chiyuv of a Kohen duchening with his hands spread is only when he is reciting the words of the bracha. The bracha, Birchas Kohanim, must be said with outstretched arms. In the mikdash, they would actually go. In the mikdash, they would lift up their hands. Outside of the mikdash, they do it horizontally rather than vertically. But when they sing between the verses, he can put down his hands. He could even sit down. I think it'd look funny, but he could, take a little break and sit down there as well. Now, in terms of the first question, am I allowed to put a sefer on top of a sefer and use the sefer as a shtender? So, first of all, on one level, if you have to respect the hierarchy. So you couldn't put a Gemara on a Chumash. That much is very, very true. Okay, so that's given. But what about a Gemara on top of a Gemara or a Chumash on top of a Chumash and the like? So me'ikar adin, it is mutter. It is mutter. Some people are machmer. I believe, I don't want to say for sure till I check it, that Rav Chaim Kanievsky was machmer. He was very, very machmer. Rav Chaim Kanievsky had, well, of course, he was a great tzaddik as well as gadol, but he had certain chumras that he was very, very strict on. And kavod of svarim, maybe that's why he remembered everything. Kavod of svarim, he was extraordinarily machmer. For example, he would never sit with his back to svarim. So if he had a bookcase, he would always position himself sitting on the side. He would not even put his back to a shas, which he's probably the only one who was knowing that way. Gedolim mamish often sit with their backs to a bookcase and the like. So he was machmer, but I think me'ikar hadin, as long as you're respecting the hierarchy of chumash and the like, you're allowed to do it. Yeah.
Here's a send-in. The Savara of Ritzicha being Yaharog Va'al Yavor is from my Chazes. Would this Savara apply to Ritzicha of Goyim also or not?
Yeah, so just a little background. We know that a Jew must be willing to give his life, or is obligated to give his life before he murders somebody. So if somebody goes over to you and says, kill Ruvain, or I'll kill you, you are mechuyev to let yourself die before you kill Ruvain, right? That's a well-known halacha, that you can't use your pikuach nefesh to kill Ruvain. Now, you can kill the guy that's threatening you, because that's rodef, that's a separate rule, but the non-rodef cannot be killed. Now, the Gemara needs a derivation for that. What's the derivation? Who says? If pikuach nefesh, if I could violate Shabbos to save my life, why can't I violate murder to save my life? So the Gemara says, I'm just repeating the question, that we have a svara. We don't need a pasuk for this. We have a svara. And the svara is, my chazis. Who says your blood is any, for some reason they always translate it, who says your blood is sweeter. The verb is not sweeter. It says, who says your blood is redder? Sumka. My chazis, didamach didach sumak tvei. Meaning, as Rashi explains, the Torah allows me to violate Shabbos and kashrus, because the Torah says the value of human life is higher than Shabbos and kashrus. But how could you say the Torah allows me to violate murder to save my life? That presupposes saving your life is more important than his life. Who says? And that's the svara why Shevi Altasa, you're not allowed to actively murder somebody other than the rodef to save your life. By the way, that itself is worthy of comment. Well, what if, I am more valuable than him? what if, I mean, you can imagine a million scenarios. The oppressor says, kill that drunk drug addict, or I'll kill you. Well, okay. Or what if, he puts a gun to the head of the Gadol Hador and says, kill that, insignificant person, or I'll kill you. So the Gadol Hador is supposed to say, even if he's modest, he says, who says my life is better than this? What about that, right? Okay, it's a good question. But the basic understanding is that we regard lives of being of infinite value. And infinity cannot be fractionalized. You can't talk about half an infinity, or half an infinity is also infinity. All infinities are, at least in basic mathematics, considered to be equal in that way. So the question that you're asking is a very excellent question. Does that apply between Jews and non-Jews? In other words, what if somebody puts a gun to my head and says, kill the innocent, not the rodef, kill the innocent non-Jew, or I'll kill you? Now, normally, of course, you're not allowed to kill a non-Jew. We're not suggesting, God forbid, that that's mutter, but the question is, can I kill a non-Jew for my pikuach nefesh? So this is obviously not a politically correct question. And as a result, we very, very rarely address it. I'm a little uncomfortable addressing it. The makor that I'm aware of is the Minchas Chinuch. And the Minchas Chinuch says that indeed my chazis does not apply as a Jew and a non-Jew. And therefore, although he emphasizes it is absolutely prohibited to kill a non-Jew, I mean, that's a given, but that would be a prohibition that would be pushed aside for the pikuach nefesh of a Jew. There are those who would argue, but such a svara does exist. In fact, this might even be a little bit of an explanation in the area of organ donation. I alluded, a short while ago, that part of the problem of organ donation is autopsy, but the truth is that was a very incomplete answer. The real problem with, let's say, heart transplants is not the autopsy of taking a heart from a dead body. That's not really the problem. In fact, most of the time, if that would be the problem, that is pikuach nefesh. You have somebody who needs the heart. The real problem is the donor dead or alive? Because basically the way it is that the legal definition of death, let's say in 50 states in the United States, and also the state of Israel, is something called brain death, meaning the heart is still beating by oxygen supplied by a respirator, but the respiratory center of the brain is destroyed. According to secular law in most places in the world, that person is declared dead and we can remove his heart. Under halacha, there's a major controversy if brain death is death or not. Now, if you're machmir and you treat brain death is not death, removal of a heart is not autopsy. Removal of a heart is murder. The real problem, the halachic problem of a heart transplant is not the same as cremation or autopsies. It is ultimately a problem of the definition of death. And the poskim argue over the definition of death. But according to the Minchas Chinuch, it could very well be that if the donor is a non-Jew, so even if the removal of the heart is halachically murder, you can murder a non-Jew to save the life of a Jew. So according to Minchas Chinuch, that would actually legitimate organ transplantation from non-Jews for the benefit of Jews. But as I say, one has to be very careful. I don't know. Unfortunately, these sessions are somewhat public, so it's hard to be reticent, and that's why I sometimes miss the old days of private communications. So one has to be very, very careful, but there is a basis in halacha for that distinction that the questioner is drawing. Yeah?
So let's say someone from Axella or something like that.
DNR, do not intubate?
Do not resuscitate.
Oh, DNR, yeah. Yeah, so here's the thing. Do not resuscitate. That means if the person goes into cardiac arrest, you don't do chest pounding, etc. Now, obviously, you're not allowed to kill somebody, right? So we're not talking about assisted suicide or whatever. We're talking about shevi al tasa. Am I mechuyev to provide medical treatment to keep somebody alive, or can I let, as the expression goes, although Yid doesn't really look at it that way, nature take its course? So this is a major issue in healthcare. It's quite amazing that I saw a statistic many years ago, I'm not sure if it's still the same, that something like, it's almost unbelievable, 2/5 of the healthcare budget is spent on people in the last week of life. These extraordinary things. An amazing amount of money as opposed to just letting people die at some point. So it's a complicated shaila. The basic rule would be that as long as we're able to keep people alive, we have a chiyuv to keep them alive because of lo samad al dam reyacha. It's not murder, but lo samad. However, Rav Moshe has a tshuva that says that even if you do something, you're only going to be marech chayim less than a year. That's called chayei shah. And the person will be suffering tremendous pain and yisurin. You're not mechuyev to put a person through pain and yisurin just for a temporary prolongation of chayei shah. Now, what that means is this, particularly in the elderly, a lot of what is done in resuscitation can be extremely painful. When you pound, the ribs can break. There can be punctured lungs, a lot of suffering, and it is generally also very ineffectual because what's going to happen is that, you keep them alive and then half an hour later you're going to have to do the same thing again. So there are heterim in those situations for a DNR. So it depends on the matzav. That's why I should say the following. Agudas Yisrael of America, which is a very prestigious, eminent religious organization, has prepared a document that is called a halachic living will. A living will is also called an advance directive. That's where you specify ahead of time, when you're healthy, what you want, what you don't want. Legally, you could say everything. Legally, you could say DNR, you could say I don't want to be fed, whatever it is. But halachic living will is two things. Number one, you specify that you want everything to be done according to halacha, and you specify the rabbi and the telephone number and the email who should be consulted, so the hospital knows who is the one that is consulted. And then number two, you can also indicate some of your preferences. So instead of simply saying, I want a DNR, you basically say, any issue of DNR should go to this Rav for a psak. And then hopefully you'll talk to the Rav ahead of time to get a sense of what the psak is. So there is room for DNR, but not in every case.
Does that same idea still apply to, let's say, putting someone on oxygen? Like we said before, someone who's brain dead. Do we have a chiyuv to put them and keep them alive in that?
So here we have an interesting psak. We have a very interesting psak from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a big chiddush. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach did not consider brain death. In other words, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, somebody with a clinical diagnosis of brain death is still alive. So if you take an organ, you're a roitzeach. But, Rav Auerbach said, the matzaf of brain death removes the chiyuv of trying to keep him alive. And therefore, you would not have to put a brain dead person on a respirator for action. So he's mechalik, a very interesting chiddush. The person's alive, there's an isur b'tzicha, there is no chiyuv to prolong his life. Now, by the way, again, this is really a whole shir in itself. I just want to be sure people understand the definition. When I talk about brain death as the legal definition of death, brain death does not mean somebody in a coma. Even under secular law, it does not mean somebody in a coma. Somebody in a coma is not conscious, but the base of their brain that operates respiration and digestion is fully functioning. A person in a coma or a persistent vegetative state is 100% alive. Even under secular law, you cannot take an organ from a comatose patient. Under secular law, not even halacha, you shoot a comatose patient, you will be tried for murder. Brain death is not the same as coma. Do not confuse them. Brain death is a neurological diagnosis that the brain stem is not functioning, and therefore there is no respiratory capacity, and all you're doing is pumping in air, like a bicycle tire, through a respiration. That is where you have the machlokas, dead or alive. But coma is 100% alive. So when I say brain dead, the problem is people colloquially call people in comas brain dead. That is not at all true. Yeah.
It says in this week's parsha, "Machashefa lo tichei," should not allow a sorcerer to live. I was wondering, what's the definition of a sorcerer, a witch?
Yeah. Yeah, so machashefa, right? Witches cannot live. And generally speaking, the Torah itself prohibits the practice of what is called kishuf. Kishuf is magic. So what is that? Is that a reality? In other words, basically a machashefa, to answer your question directly, is a woman who practices magic. So the question is, what is magic? So the Rambam immediately has a certain problem. I mean, many Rishonim understand that magic is a reality. There is indeed what you might call dark forces, forces of evil. We don't really have a sense of what they are, in which a person could tap in to these forces of evil and do things. And therefore what the Torah is prohibiting is the actual practice of a reality that is called magic, which would mean today it probably does not exist at all, meaning people who are Satan worshippers or people who are witches. Wicca is the religion of witches. They have rituals. They may be of the Avodah Zarah, that's possible, but they're not guilty of machashefa because as far as I know, they're not doing real magic. And perhaps we don't even have real magic. So if you understand that magic is a reality, then I think the scope of the Isser is pretty pashut. It has to be a woman who practices kishuf and not just what we call a witch today. The problem what you have is, the problem that you're raising is much more acute according to the Rambam. The Rambam, based on his rationalistic tendency, denies that there is such a thing as kishuf. Even what the Egyptians did is basically optical illusions, hypnosis, and the like. There is no such reality as magic, just as the Rambam says, for example, there is no such reality as demons. And the Vilna Gaon attacks him. The Vilna Gaon says the Rambam was led astray by his preoccupation with accursed Greek philosophy. So here's the question. So if the Rambam says there's no such thing as magic, what does the Torah mean when it says thou shalt not practice magic? And people who practice magic get killed. It has to mean even fake magic because there is no real magic. Wow. So what does that mean? I do magic tricks in front of cancer patients in a children's ward. I'm going to be chayav misa. There are, in fact, from people who do magic tricks. So you have to be magdir it this way. Like the Rambam, the definition of machashefa is much more problematical. And that is, no such thing as magic, but somebody who is trying to convey to you that it is a reality. In other words, when I'm a magician and everybody knows it's just tricks, that's going to be much, or even like the Rambam. You can be a magician, you can do card tricks, you can pull a pigeon out of your shirt sleeve, whatever it is, because everybody knows it's a trick that takes a lot of skill. But if you are representing yourself as being able to effect these realities, so according to the Rambam, machashefa is not defined by what you're really doing, but it's defined by what you're trying to represent yourself as really doing. The bottom line, though, is that unless one is representing themselves as tapping into the powers of Tuma, they are not guilty of magic just because they're doing magic tricks or whatever. So that does mean that schools like Hogwarts, Harry Potter, you would be a... Well, I'll tell you one, I'll give you a kula for Hogwarts and a chumrah of Hogwarts. The kula of Hogwarts is that you might be allowed, assuming there's no issue of magic, just put that aside, you might be allowed to do these tricks even on Shabbos. Why? It's based on a tashchis in Maseches Menachos. The Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu, actually, I'm sorry, Taisus brings, the reason why we say tzidkas chatzedek, God's judgments are good, and there are 3 verses, Shabbos Mincha, because 3 righteous people died Shabbos afternoon, and we express a certain mourning for them. It was Yosef HaTzadik, it was Moshe Rabbeinu, and David. So Taisus and Menachos asks the kasha, how can we say that Moshe Rabbeinu died Shabbos afternoon? According to Chazal's understanding, on the last day of his life, he wrote 13 Sifrei Torah. 1 went into the Mishkan, and 1, each Shevet got its own Sefer Torah. So 13 Sifrei Torah. He wrote, if he died on Shabbos, how could Moshe Rabbeinu write it on Shabbos? So Tosafos' answer is, since by definition this writing was supernatural, it was not normal writing, so Tosafos says, malachos that you do supernaturally, b'derech nes, are more or less not called malachos for Hilchos Shabbos, and therefore Moshe could write 13 Torahs derech nes. So that would be a heter to attend Hogwarts on even on Shabbos. But leidach gisa, the other side of it is there would be an isser d'oraisa of kishuf, right? So that's also a chiyuv misa. So you're okay for chilul Shabbos, but you got a problem with kishuf. Yeah.
I was going to say, just on that, so do we say that all of the building of the tabernacle, all the malachas for that were mundane malachas, that they were like of teva, of the world?
Yeah, that would be our assumption. And indeed, there's a good religious reason for that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to bring the Shekhinah into the world by our heavenly efforts. So, not by our earthly efforts. Yeah.
Didn't they pick up the walls supernaturally?
For the Mishkan?
Yeah.
Well, it does say that for the 7 days of preparation, which preceded the dedication of the Mishkan, that Moshe Rabbeinu single-handedly was able to pick up and take down the walls. But it seems that for the rest of the sojourn in the desert, once the Mishkan was dedicated, it had to be put up b'day Adam. Yeah.
Here's another send-in. At non-Jewish weddings, as some of us have seen in the movies, the person officiating always says, if anyone objects to this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yes.
Since they copied so much of our religion, I am wondering if this was ever a part of Jewish practice. Alternatively, if it's 100% of non-Jewish origin, why is it antithetical to an authentic Jewish wedding?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any particular minhag that existed where the Masader Kedushin or the Rav would announce if anyone has an objection. Now, the truth of the matter is, ali b'di'emes, if somebody does have an objection, they should speak up. I mean, if you know that somebody is puzzle, you know the woman is divorced and she's marrying a Kohen, but I don't believe there was any formal tachnit, any formal ceremony where a person would speak up. I don't know the origin of the Christian practice. I'll try to check into it. Presumably it arose because of a need. These things don't arise just amazai. Presumably there were situations where marriages were not appropriate and people needed to speak up, so they kind of incorporated it, and it could very well have been that it was borrowed from a one-time Jewish thing where some Christian who had been Jewish or whatever had observed it and then thought, hey, that's a smart idea, and made it into a ritual. But I'll try to research it. I don't know off the top of my head. Now, there's another, this just reminds me of something else, which is not your question, but it reminds me of this. In the Ashkenazi communities of Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, there actually was a common practice that synagogue services would be interrupted on Shabbos before Kriyas HaTorah for people to air their grievances. You actually have a situation, and women often did this. Women would go into the men's section, and they would stop the davening, and they would get up in the bima, and they would say, my husband abandoned me, and, he left me with 5 orphans, what are you going to do about it? And there's all sorts of tshuvas about interrupting shul, interrupting davening, about women coming into the men's section. This was a fairly common practice where the davening would be interrupted in order that the kehillah would deal with a particular grievance that somebody was suffering. Yeah.
How do you prioritize between davening and learning? Let's say someone feels like putting too much effort into learning takes away from the davening, or vice versa.
Well, obviously, the short answer is you got to do both. But the question is that you're davening late, and you'll be missing some learning because of the davening. Say what there?
Or just effort-wise,
Effort, yeah. It's a good question. I'll tell you this. The Vilna Gaon says that a person should limit the amount of time he davens, but the Vilna Gaon says that means don't daven more than 3 hours a day. so as a practical matter, he's not really limiting the davening. But I would say this. I would say that all of the Gedolim tell us that the effort you put into davening will not diminish your learning. That's the thing. Because Hashem will open up brachas for you precisely because of your relationship into tefillah. So even if that would mean that a longer davening might take away from some of your learning, all that means is you will accomplish in less time what would have taken you more time. So what you would accomplish in an hour and a half, you'll be able to do in an hour because of the effort you put in tefillah. So I wouldn't look at it as a contest. I wouldn't look at it like a zero-sum game, that what I invest in prayer will somehow come out of my learning. I think it's the other way around. The tefillah will enhance your learning in a lot of ways, as long as you don't go beyond the 3 hour limit. Yeah.
I had a question about the ger katan process.
Yeah.
From my research, the person is supposed to be asked at age 13, and then he is chayav if he says yes for his entire life. So some questions is, 13 seems young to make a lifelong decision, something that's going to affect the person. Second, what if he wasn't asked at 13? What if he was asked at 15? What if he feels he was under duress because his parents were in the room? Or was in a mussar yeshiva and the question was, you want to be Jewish, right? I mean, what if after 35 years he realizes he just doesn't like Jews? They haven't been so good to him except for, let's say, Somayach and a handful of people, What if he just changes his mind, and what if he was just doing it not to go to hell?
Yeah. So just to be sure everyone has the basic information, normally in order for a conversion to Judaism to be valid, there are 3 conditions, and all 3 should be done in front of a beis din of 3 rabbis. There is a bris for a man, there is immersion in a mikveh for man and woman, and there is a formal declaration that they will live their lives in accordance with the mitzvahs of the Torah, man and woman. In fact, that's done before the mikveh, etc. And those are the 3 conditions. If those conditions are not met, and if it's not in front of a kosher beis din, the conversion is invalid. Now, based on that standard alone, the conversion of a child below bar mitzvah would be impossible, because anyone below bar mitzvah is below the age of consent, and converting a baby would certainly not make sense. And yet the Gemara in Kesuvos legitimates the ability to convert minors, and by a minor we mean even a baby that's 1 day old. I don't mean a 10-year-old only, a 1-day-old baby, based on the idea that even though the katan does not have any intention or any consent, but since being a Jew is a good thing, we can confer benefits on people even without their consent if they're not capable of giving consent. This is called zachin li adam shelo b'fanav. And in fact, that's what's commonly done with adoptions. For various reasons, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva that if a Jewish couple wants to adopt, it is halachically easier to adopt a non-Jewish child that you convert than to adopt a Jewish child. It's a bigger mitzvah to adopt a Jewish child, but the reason why it's halachically more complicated is that the Jewish child might be a mamzer. You don't know the parents, etc. A non-Jewish child, no matter what the circumstances, even if it was adultery, is not a mamzer. So what we do is we convert a baby. What does that mean? The baby is circumcised if it's a boy. The baby goes to the mikveh. That doesn't mean you throw the baby in the mikveh, but dad will go into the mikveh and hold the baby down for a second in his arms. And the acceptance of the mitzvos is not on the part of the baby, but the parents agree they will raise the child in accordance with the Torah. Now, this is a totally valid conversion. This is called the conversion of a ger katan. But there's one big major difference between the conversion of a minor and the conversion of an adult. The conversion of an adult is irrevocable. Once you have decided to become Jewish, even if you change your mind, you're like any other Jew that goes off the derech, you're Jewish. If a Christian converted to Judaism and then reconverted to Christianity, he is Jewish, and there's a mitzvah to be makarev him. On the other hand, since the gerus of a katan is not based on actual consent, but it's based on presumed merit, when he reaches the age of 13, the age of adulthood, he has the right to renounce his conversion. By the way, people often say, I'm glad you did not make this mistake. People often say, when he reaches 13, he must go to the mikveh again. Not true. He does not have to go to the mikveh again. He certainly doesn't have to have a bris again. Rather, he has the right to renounce his conversion and become a goy. And by the way, he could later convert as an adult. That doesn't stop him from going back. So, the rule of the halacha is this, though. It's a little different than you said. You don't have to actually ask him. It works this way. If he fails to renounce his conversion within a reasonable time after his adulthood, that is considered to be acceptance. He doesn't have to accept. Failure to reject equals acceptance. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein once again has a tshuva. In order for a failure to reject to be deemed an acceptance, the child had to know that he had the right to reject. So Rav Moshe says, if the child didn't know this halacha, he wasn't told this halacha, and he doesn't find out this halacha until he's learning kesuvos in Daf Yomi when he's 45 years old, then he has the right to reject it then. So, if he knew the halacha and didn't reject, then he is stuck. Then it becomes an irrevocable decision. If he didn't know the halacha, he'll have the right to reject within a reasonable time, whatever that means, after he does find out. Now, that's why I always tell parents of adopted children who converted that be very nice to your kid around his bar mitzvah, because if you're being too tough for him and making him, laying a whole parsha, whatever it is, he might, after you paid for the hall, he might decide to be a guy, and then you kind of you've lost your deposit. Now, generally speaking, you almost never hear about a kid who was converted as a katan, saying, I don't want to be Jewish. But I actually had a case like this. This was a Russian couple, and she was non-Jewish, but she converted along with their child, who was converted as a minor. And they called me one day. Their child is now, 15, and says they don't understand what's going on. They say, my child says he doesn't want to be Jewish anymore. He says, what is he talking about? They didn't know any of these halachas. And it turned out that the kid learned the halacha when he was 15 about this, and he wanted to renounce. But he had a spiritual reason why he wanted to renounce. He said, listen, I would rather be a Noachite and get Olam Haba based on the 7 commandments of Noach than to be a Jew that's going to get punished for every little avera. So let me be a Noach. I'll be a righteous Noachite. Almost l'shem shemayim, renunciation. So I tried to talk him out of it. I said, listen, you're a Jew. What are you fooling around here? But I believe he did. I was not involved in the renunciation process per se. I believe he did renounce. And several years later, he reconverted as an adult. And I believe he lives in Yerushalayim with a mishpach. He's a ben Torah. He's a ben Torah in Kollel. But he did have a lot of problems with the Rabbanut. The Rabbanut couldn't. The Rabbanut anyway has problems with all conversions, and they couldn't really process. You were converted, then you reconverted and renounced. Well, they really couldn't understand what was going on. But that's exactly what happened. He renounced his conversion as a minor, and then he affirmed his conversion. There he had to reconvert. See, that's different, you see? When he renounces and then says later, I want to be Jewish, he does have to go through the conversion. So in terms of Brit Milah, you got to let out some blood. He has to go to the mikveh again. But if he's not renouncing, there's no reconversion that's needed. Now, an interesting shaila of Chaim Ozer Grodzinski raises is, What is the meaning of renouncing? Let me give you a concrete example. Let's assume you adopted a child, and when the child is 13, he decides he doesn't want to be frum anymore. He stops keeping mitzvos. Is that called a renunciation that invalidates the conversion? So Rav Chaim Ozer draws an interesting distinction between not wanting to be Jewish and not wanting to be frum. In fact, it's very common. A lot of people, let's say you have a teenager who stopped keeping mitzvahs. If you were to ask him the question, do you want to be not Jewish? Many, not all, many would say, of course I want to be Jewish. I'm a Jew. I don't want to be frum. So Rav Chaim Ozer says, not wanting to be frum is not a renunciation of Judaism. It's a renunciation of the Torah, but it's not a renunciation of wanting to be Jewish. In order to renounce, you literally have to say, I don't want to be a member of the Jewish people. And that is, Baruch Hashem, a very, very rare situation. So the Gemara does not say in front of a beis din, but the minhag is that we do want a formal declaration, because otherwise people have thoughts go back and forth. Like, the teenager has a bad day and says, "Oh, I don't want to be Jewish." It has to be a serious enough thing that we take this as a commitment. Yeah.
Yeah, assuming autopsies are illegal according to Jewish law, is it by everyone hold that way? And then if not, if everyone hold that way, can you find a heter for, let's say, to save a life in the future? Can you then do autopsy?
Right. So I addressed this earlier. The basic idea is autopsies are permitted if it can yield life-saving information for somebody who's presently in danger, meaning you're not allowed to do autopsies for long-term benefits. There has to be an immediate beneficiary. By the way, I want to just add something to the autopsy discussion. This was a major issue, and it is still an issue, in medical school, because the way medical students traditionally would learn human anatomy is they would dissect actual corpses. Now, this is not the autopsy, for a specific medical reason. This is general educational autopsies. And based on the Noda B'Yehuda, the general educational autopsy would be absolutely usher. The interesting question is, do the autopsy prohibitions apply to non-Jewish autopsies? Some matter it. There's a raya from War B'choros. Rav Kook has a long tshuva that the yesod of autopsies is a violation of being made in the image of God, and that applies Jews and non-Jews. So as a result, medical schools are trying to move away from the use of cadavers. And the truth is, with computer simulations, which are getting better and better and better and better, it's possible to replace, but still, one probably has to admit that there is nothing like the real thing. So it's an issue that people are struggling with. Halacha does not really allow those types of autopsies, and the question is, how does a doctor train if he's not allowed to do those autopsies? Yeah.
So I recently had a scenario where
I
recently had a scenario where I matched with a cancer patient to donate blood to him, and they flew me out to America, and I wasn't really sure. It took 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, and I wasn't really sure if it was Jewish or not. I want to know how push it is that scenario to just take off 3 weeks from yeshiva to go save a life.
The issue is you go onto a registry. This was for blood or for bone marrow? It was bone marrow.
Bone marrow.
Whatever, a bone marrow registry. And then when they find a person who is compatible with you, because the body rejects non-compatible material, so you'll be notified, and may take a while. You may be stuck there. If you're working, you take off from work. If you're learning, you're taking off from learning, and that's a serious thing. So the question is, should I take off my learning? Because I can always say no. Right? I can say no. So, and is there a difference if it's Jew, Goy, and the like? So let's first take the case of a Jew. If it's the case of a Jew, you do have a chiyuv d'oraisa to help save a Jewish life. That's leisamad al dam reyacha. But even in the case of a Jew, you have to ask yourself this question, are you the only one? Meaning, there's a general rule for Talmud Torah that you don't take off Torah for a mitzvah that can be done by somebody else, even pikuach nefesh. So the question you'd have to know, I don't know if they tell you, is there somebody else on the list that is compatible? If they are, then you have the right to say no. If there isn't, then you have to go. You have to go. Now, with respect to a non-Jew, it's a little more complicated, really. It's not such an easy question, because halachically, even if you're allowed to donate, and I'm assuming you are allowed, some people are machmir in that, but let's assume you're allowed, but you're not chayav to do it. So the question becomes, do you have a justification to be mevatel Torah for something you're not even chayav to do? Technically, the answer is probably no, you shouldn't be mevatel, but that has to be counterbalanced with what Chazal describe as Eva. Eva is hatred, meaning if you refuse to save a non-Jew's life, you may be causing tremendous hatred against the Jewish people and against the Torah, and that would be an override to go for the 3 weeks. Now, well, okay, Eva is the flip side. Kiddush Hashem is the positive. Eva is the negative. But I would just tell you, I'm saying you said you already went, right? That's what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Baruch Hashem. Did you know was it a successful?
Baruch Hashem, I think it was.
Well,
It's a suffix if he was Jew or not. So.
no, I understand. But even for non-Jews, there's at least the Kiddush Hashem as well as the Eva of not doing it. So, but you have to be careful that even if I'm away from yeshiva for 3 weeks, I'm still going to be koveya itim la Torah. I'm not going to just treat it as a long vacation. You know, there's a vort from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. It's a bit of a bittersweet vort. You know, it says in Pirkei Avos, Ein ben chayren elamisha isek b'Torah. The only person who's free is a person who learns Torah. Right? That's chayros. Real freedom is Torah. So he says, he understands it now. He says, in New York, there's like a chasna every night. Every night there's sheva brachas chasanas, etc. And yeshiva guys are always taking off. Like every night seder, there's a wedding in Brooklyn that they go to. He says, if you had a job, you couldn't take off from your job to go to this party and that party and that party. But if all you're doing is learning, you can take off for everything. So he says, that's the pshat. No one is free except if they're learning. When they're learning, they're lagamri ben chayren. They can do whatever they want. And that's, once again, one has to look. In fact, someone to say, in the morning when we say Birchas HaTorah, we say, Asher Kiddishana b'mitzvaysa v'tzivano lasaik b'divrei Torah, to occupy ourselves with Torah. So they say, asek is also the word for business, lasaik. He says, Torah is your business. You got to look at it like it's your job. And therefore, you have to treat it at least, I mean, it should be much more, but at least as seriously as you treat your job. So it's something to think about. Yeah?
At which point do we say that carrying a gun would be a legitimate shtender?
Yeah, once again, this is a hard question. I can just tell you that Rav Asher Weiss, Shlita, did say beferish, that he thought that more B'nai Torah should carry guns, and he considered it to be a legitimate hishtadlus. Now, obviously, not everybody agrees with that because you don't really see. In fact, I don't think Rav Asher Weiss carries a gun. I mean, it's a little hard to figure out. But you don't see a widespread carrying of guns. This can change from day to day to day to day. My own hargasha is that right now it's not yet necessary in regular places like Yerushalayim, but things can change. Things can very, very definitely change, and one has to be attuned to it. And some feel that you ought to get the training now. So if chas v'shalom it gets more necessary, you'll be able to step in because, you can't just get a gun tomorrow. If I decide I need a gun, I can't just get it tomorrow. I have to go through a period of training. So maybe it's better to plan now. Me'inyan, I mean, right now that the U.S. is putting a lot of pressure for Israel to give, 130-day truce to allow Hamas to rebuild, the world of absurdity, to allow Hamas to rebuild its military structure in exchange for releasing hostages. So, we hope that that's not going to happen, but that can also increase, God forbid, the dangers. So it's something to be aware of. Yeah.
How do we define emunah peshuta
how do they define it?
Yeah, the term emunah peshuta, these are often terms that are contrasted. We have emunah b'derech chakira. Chakira is philosophical understanding of emunah, in which you try to prove the existence of God by rigid and logical, systematic, philosophical thoughts. And emunah peshuta is more of the intuitive emunah that is based on emotion and feeling. As you know, the Rambam was the great expounder of an emunah that was rooted in rational philosophy. Others, actually the Kuzari, and much later, of course, Hasidus and Kabbalah, were much more emphatic in terms of this intuitive connection. And in fact, they considered philosophy to be a very, very bad thing, because if you think about it, the Rambam created a dilemma that's almost impossible to bridge. The Rambam says, you are mechuyev to philosophically investigate the existence of God, and you're mechuyev to come out that you believe in Him. Now, you understand there's a problem here, because if I'm commanded to philosophically investigate something, how can I be commanded that I have to come out with a conclusion? Right? You're commanded to be philosophical and come out with the right answer. You know, it's not always possible. So as a result, other than the Rambam, the Mahalach has generally been better not to get into that if you don't have to get into that, because you're opening up a Pandora's box of coerced and kfira. And once the genie is out of the box, if I can use Bodhisattva imagery, it's hard to put it back in. This is the phenomenon that I've spoken about. I thought I invented the term, but somebody told me it was already being used. I call this the mir apikoros. Again, without meaning to single out mir. But this is the phenomenon, which is a very unfortunate phenomenon, of B'nai Torah, some in Kailel Mamish, who after years of learning, all of a sudden say, I don't know what the proof is for God, I don't know what the proof of the Torah, etc. Because once they get involved, it's like a poison in many ways. Now, that's why, which in Or Somayach we do, not me necessarily, but Rabbi Dr. does explore these issues. That's simply because our clientele has already been exposed to them, meaning to say, you know Richard Dawkins, you know Christopher Hitchens, you know Sam Harris, you know these guys. All right? So once you have taken the poison, so we have to try to supply the antidote to the poison as best as we can. But many have argued it's better not to get into those questions at all, because you never know where you're going to come out. So emunah peshuta is based on the notion of I believe in God, without having to be philosophical about it. But it's important to add the following. People sometimes say that emunah peshuta is irrational. It's blind leaps of faith. That is not emes. The emes is, even emunah peshuta is not necessarily philosophically sophisticated, but it is based on premises of looking at the world, looking at the wonder of the world, looking at the complexity of nature, looking at the miracle of Jewish survival. It is not ignorant of looking at the factors that point to God. It just doesn't develop them in a rigorous academic, philosophical way. So there really is no such thing as an emunah peshuta that's not based on any type of rationality. Even emunah peshuta has its own internal rationality. That's important, yeah.
What is daas Torah, and how do we know we can read the main book?
Yeah, so the word daas Torah, you hear it a lot, and it really was popularized, really, by Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, and that is the following. Some people have a view of Gedolei Torah that they are plumbers. What do I mean by that? A plumber is a person with a certain expertise. A plumber knows how to fix sinks. So when I have a sink that I need to fix, I go to a good plumber. But a plumber doesn't necessarily know anything about brain surgery or about fixing cars or about politics or the like. So some people have a view that Gedolei Torah are experts in Jewish law. So if I have a shaila in halacha, I go to a gadol or a posek or a rav or whatever it would be. But When I have a general question about how do I raise my kids, or who we should vote for, or whatever it is, so the idea is, my opinion is just as good as his opinion. The chiddush of das Torah is that people who learn Torah in a righteous way, I don't mean just scholars, people who learn Torah and are mussar to Torah, have a special connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And because they have a special connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, their views on everything are more likely to be emes, even if it is beyond the particular area of their expertise. Right? So das Torah is the system that recognizes that Gedolei Torah have a perception which is a form of prophecy, almost a form of Ruach HaKodesh in some ways, that even if they never had experience with certain areas, they'll have an intuition of what the Ratzon Hashem is. Now you understand that's a bit of a controversial idea, because some say, hey, if a gadol spent his whole life learning Shas and Shulchan Aruch, then I trust him for things that are in the Shas and Shulchan Aruch, not necessarily other things. Das Torah says he's connected to everything. Now, because of this, das Torah can exist in greater or lesser proportions, meaning in a sense, every person, even us, every person who learns Torah has a certain amount of das Torah, but it's likely to be relatively small, right? So it's not that every Talmid Chacham has das Torah at its maximum level, but all of us have something. Chaim Volozhiner says, if you have a shaila in life and you're not sure what to do, you should learn for 2 hours straight. And whatever you feel after those 2 hours is your das Torah coming through. So when we talk about das Torah, though, as a veto, the final word, so we're really talking about only the greatest of the Gedolim. So then you're asking me a question again, how do you define who is a Gadol, who is a Torah leader? It's a very, very good question. Who defines what's a Gadol? This is a live controversy here in Eretz Yisrael. We have, let's say, I'm being simplistic here. We have the Haredi world, let's say, we have the Dati Leumi world. Now that Dati Leumi world has some great Talmidei Chachamim, who some would regard as a Gadol. Within the Haredi world, they sometimes might not regard them as a Gadol. So, who has das Torah when you're not sure who the Gadol is? I can't really answer that because that runs us into a circle. Meaning, das Torah is something that is the province of a Gadol. So, if you hold he's a Gadol, then there's das Torah. If you hold he's not a Gadol, then it's not das Torah. Right? But that doesn't give you the standards. That depends on your kehila. Now, I will say one thing. I think the Meshech Chochmah said that the sign of who is a Gadol is whether he is accepted by other Gedolim. It's not necessarily popular vote. It's if other Gedolim see him as a Gadol, then min hashamayim he probably is a Gadol. Of course, at some point, you get into a problem of who made them Gedolim, right? But you have this issue. On the other hand, there's another mahalach that actually says Klal Yisrael itself has an intuition to whom they gravitate, regardless. There was a beautiful interview, I mentioned this before, with Rav Moshe Feinstein in the New York Times in the 1970s. And it was an article about Rav Moshe Feinstein. Actually, somebody unearthed it and sent it to me. But like Rav Moshe was being interviewed or on his 70th birthday or something. And the question became like, how did you become the big guy? Meaning, why does everybody go to you? So Rav Moshe, in his very charming and humble way, said, people ask you a shaila. They see a rabbi with a beard, and they ask a shaila, and they like the answer. The answer makes sense to them, so they tell people around, there's this rabbi you could ask. So, so another person asks. So eventually, a lot of people ask questions, because people gravitate. Actually, I heard from my own Rosh Hashiva, Rav Weinberg, who grew up on the Lower East Side. He said that Rav Moshe became very popular because most Rabbanim charged when they looked at chickens. In the olden days, you have to buy your chicken and it was shechted, and you had to inspect it for abnormalities. So often you had to bring the chicken to the Rav. So every Rav on the Lower East Side charged a nickel for looking at a chicken. Says Rav Moshe did it for free. So that itself created a certain popularity. But there is this notion that Klal Yisrael gravitates to. So Rav Meir Simcha says it's the Gedolim that choose the Gedolim. Rav Moshe's story may indicate Klal Yisrael chooses the Gedolim. Yeah.
Yeah, in our new generation, there's many young people going off the better, so to say. Especially when they have they're saying that Shabbat is boring nowadays.
Yeah.
They sleep all day, especially youngsters again. Would it be possible, halachically, in a legal way, to let's say, playing the guitar legal on Shabbat in order to prevent more cell phones or going out?
Yeah. I really respect the question. The question is a real difficult question. And it's a question for people who are even totally committed to be from. They're not even struggling with, I'm going to desecrate Shabbos. But there are people that Shabbos, which is supposed to be the most holy day, the most enjoyable day, the most pleasurable day, Shabbos can be a torture for people. If you're not connected, so if Baruch Hashem, you like to learn Torah, Baruch Hashem, you have the bracha of hours and hours and hours of learning Torah. There's no pleasure greater than that. But what if you don't like to learn Torah? Nebuch, you don't like to learn Torah. So you have a davening, and you have eating, and then you have sleep. But how long do you sleep? Anyway, kids don't sleep that much anyway. In fact, I remember when I was in 9th grade, and I had not been used to taking a Shabbos nap. And now I do it already, but then I didn't. And the whole yeshiva was asleep. I remember the whole yeshiva was asleep Shabbos afternoon. I was going crazy. I didn't know what to do. I was like wandering the halls in search of somebody, like nobody was alive, right? So Shabbos, you can go crazy. In the winter, you go crazy Friday night, the long nights. In the summer, maybe it's even worse. Shabbos is over at 8 o'clock. So you're raising an interesting proposal. And the proposal will be, well, let's take something like playing a musical instrument. Now, playing a musical instrument on Shabbos is not one of the 39 malachos. In fact, under Torah law, it's absolutely permitted, under Torah law. Elamai, the Chachamim made a gezerah that you're not allowed to play musical instruments on Shabbos because they were afraid that maybe it would break, a string would break or something, and you would fix the instrument, and that is a malacha. That's the malacha of makeh b'patish, of making a kli. So this is the familiar gezerah form. Don't do X, which is mutter, because maybe you'll do Y. So your question would be, well, listen, if I have a kid, and if the kid goes crazy enough, he'll want to text or want to turn on his iPhone or whatever it would be, and he might be transgressing malachos da'oraisa. Maybe it would be better for me to permit infractions that are less chamor in order to avoid infractions that are much more severe. Right? That's the old issue. So all I can tell you is, certainly we would not allow this as a public statement. We would not simply, in other words, to simply say, we hereby permit the playing of guitar on Shabbos because we feel it'll prevent more serious transgressions. You cannot make such a psak as a public matter. But if you're asking me, if I have an individual child that is struggling, is there a makom to permit? The answer is there might be a consideration that we're permitting something to avoid something worse. And in halacha, there is such a dynamic. But it can't be like a public, wholesale dispensation, because we do not have the koach to matir an isur drabanan. Even if it came from the chachamim, we're bound by those rules until the Sanhedrin comes. When we have a new Sanhedrin, they can repeal these things, but we cannot do it on our own. Yeah.
I'll say that once there's Hashem gives reshus to the mashtis to be to harm people, so it won't necessarily always differentiate between a tzaddik and a rasha. And like the Gemara gives an example of Saddam Ali one time
he took the wrong person before his time with the same name. So I was just wondering, like, how do we understand that? How sometimes even tzaddikim who aren't necessarily befitting will be punished due to, like, I guess, like tragedy or difficulty that's coming on a wholesale level.
Yeah, so there are two questions here. The general question is, how could it be that tzaddikim who are righteous, right, it says by the Malach HaMaves, once Hashem releases powers of destruction in the world, those powers will sometimes not differentiate between the righteous and the evil, which means innocent people may in fact be swept up. How do we understand that? That's not just. Doesn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu run the world? And why would Hashem allow that to happen? So one answer might be that when you have strict midas hadin in the world, the tzaddik himself is judged at a different level, meaning the tzaddik alone would not have triggered midas hadin. But once the midas hadin is opened up, the tzaddik is chayiv in midas hadin, because midas hadin is so tough that even tzaddikim fail the standard. On his own level, yeah. That's one way of understanding it. Yeah. Now, your second question, though, is really a pella, that the Malach HaMaves took the wrong guy. How do you understand that? That's already a pella. How could it be that God would allow that type of mistake to take place? There too, the only way I could explain it is this. When somebody dies, and this goes back to the Arachaim and all sorts of things, there are two ways that could happen. One is God decreed that the person dies. The other is God removed his hashgacha pratis. So now he's vulnerable to the mikrei hateva. So it could be that the idea of a mistake was this person did not deserve to die, but he was in a matzav where he deserved a removal of hashgacha pratis. And therefore, whatever happens is whatever happens. And therefore, that's how it would be shaykh. Yeah.
Recently, I heard with the whole terrorist attack, and in the past as well, people in Israel, in the Jewish communities, tried pulling together a Sanhedrin. I was curious on what the parameters are of first pulling together a Sanhedrin, and also with just today how it is in Judaism with so many different sects that recently in the past 200 years have kind of propped up and become so prominent. How would getting a central Sanhedrin together be possible?
Yeah, so first of all, there is an organization in Jerusalem right now that is called the Sanhedrin. I mean, almost nobody pays attention to it, but they have a website and you can check it out, and they have some chashuv people, some less chashuv people on it and the like. But let me just go back and say the very issue you're raising was a major issue in Klal Yisrael in the time of Rav Yosef Karo. If you ask me the question why we don't have a Sanhedrin, because if we did, we could repeal all sorts of things. The short answer is a Sanhedrin requires people that have smicha. Now, in spite of the fact that every person who goes by the name rabbi has something called smicha, we are all frauds, we are all imposters. None of us have smicha. We simply have a heter from our rabbis or our yeshivas to pasken shilas. We do not have smicha. Smicha requires unbroken ordination from Moshe Rabbeinu by the laying of hands. Some say you don't need laying of hands, but it's an unbroken ordination. This was a chain that continued through the period of the Mishnah, after the Churban, and even into the period of the Amoraim. But at one point in the Roman persecutions, the last person who had that unbroken chain was killed before he passed it on. Since then, we don't have smicha. If we don't have smicha, we can't have a Sanhedrin. Now, in the 1500s in Tzfat, there was a great rabbi. He was the Rebbe of Rav Yosef Karo, Rav Yaakov Beirav. And based on his interpretation of the Rambam, so Machlokas had learned the Rambam seems to have created a ruling that if all of the Chachmei Yisrael want to recreate smicha, they could create it yesh me'ayin. They could create ex nihilo. They could create smicha, ordain people, and create a Sanhedrin. Rav Yaakov Beirav actually wanted to be machadesh smicha because he felt as well this would bring Mashiach. Sanhedrin would bring the Mashiach. He actually ordained 4 Chachamim. Rav Yosef Karo, the Mabit, Moshe ben Yosef Trane, I believe the Alshich. These were rabbis of Tzfat, great rabbis of Tzfat, and Rav Moshe Galante, who must have been a very great man, although we don't know a lot about him. And some of them continued it to a second generation. What happened was it petered out after that. It was never continued because the Rambam's condition was that the Chachamim have to agree, and the Chachmei Yerushalayim did not agree. Rav Levi ben Chaviv, he's the son of the Ein Yaakov Mechaber, Yaakov ben Chaviv, held that you can't do it. So as a result, the idea of Chidush HaSmicha got discontinued. Now Napoleon created a body, the Napoleon Sanhedrin, but that although it did have some chashuv d'milchama, but that was fake. I mean, that did not have the authority of a Sanhedrin under any eifin at all. It was kind of just a show thing. So basically, unless you would go back to Rav Yaakov Beirav's Hatza'ah, Chiddush of the Sanhedrin is impossible. And even the body that's called the Sanhedrin just makes the claim that we are just doing this as a dry run to prepare ourselves when Mashiach comes. So how will the Sanhedrin be established when Mashiach comes? Eliyahu Hanavi has smicha. So Eliyahu Hanavi is going to ordain the greatest Talmidei Chachamim, and they will be on the Sanhedrin. So right now, there's no way we could do it. And even if we followed the Rambam, there's no way we can do it because we're not going to get agreement of Chachmei Yisrael. Yeah.
My question is slavery immoral? And if so, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu make it asur?
Yeah, a very excellent question. Slavery. Is slavery immoral? And if it is really a bad thing, then why does Hashem legitimate slavery? Why does the Torah permit slavery? So again, it's getting late. I'm going to give you 2 quickie answers. There are 2 different approaches in the Meforshim. Some say slavery is a bad thing, but since slavery was so common in the world, the ancient world at the time, if Hashem would have said just don't do it, people wouldn't listen. So instead of forbidding it outright, HaKadosh Baruch Hu regulated it, humanized it, made it better, made it more moral, with the hope and the expectation that eventually it would peter away. Similar to polygamy, and similar to the Rambam's famous explanation about korbanos. Remember the Rambam's explanation about korbanos? That Hashem doesn't want sacrifices, but this was a concession to Avodah Zarah. So seen in this way, slavery was a temporary concession to the imperfections of human nature. Now, I have a big kasha on that. I have a very big kasha on that, because the halacha is, if you have a non-Jewish slave, you are not allowed to free him. Now my question is, if slavery is bad, but it's just a concession, then fakert. If I want to free my slave, it ought to be a good thing, not a bad thing. Now the other approach, which is not politically correct, is given by the Netziv. The Netziv says there actually is a moral basis for slavery. It was a way of civilizing savage and immoral populations. You took captives of war, you took Ovdei Avodah Zarah, you took murderers, and you brought them into a Jewish environment, and they learned many mitzvos, etc. And this was a way of bringing them into a civilized environment. Now, Jewish slavery is not slavery. That's the first thing. In other words, I'm talking about non-Jewish slavery is slavery. Jewish slavery is simply, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, the Gemara says that he who buys a Jewish slave bought a master. If you have one good pillow, he gets it, he gets the best food. So that's just a way of helping somebody who needs a job, essentially. So when people ask about the morality of slavery, they should be thinking about non-Jewish slavery, not Jewish slavery. But non-Jewish slavery, these are the 2 approaches. Yeah?
How do we pasken regarding lulav and gazel on Yom Sheni, taking into consideration mitzvah ba'be avera? And can we apply the verdict in a situation of someone stealing money, for example, to give it to the poor? Do they get a mitzvah for giving that money to tzedakah, or do we consider it mitzvah ba'be avera?
Yeah. So this is the Gemara in Sukkah. Again, the Gemara in Sukkah tells us that a stolen lulav is not kosher for the mitzvah, And the Gemara says, I understand on the first day it's not kosher because the Torah says it has to belong to you, and a stolen lulav doesn't belong to you. But on the second day, there's no requirement. I could borrow it. So why would a stolen lulav be pasul? So there's a machlokus in the Gemara. One opinion says, you're right, on the second day it is kosher. But the other opinion says, no, even on the second day it's not kosher, or chol hamoed it's not kosher, because a mitzvah that is done through a sin, it's not only you have a sin, that for sure, but you don't even have a mitzvah. A mitzvah babi avera is an avera without a mitzvah. La halacha, we absolutely pasken mitzvah babi avera, and therefore la halacha, it's a davar pashat that a stolen lulav is invalid every day of Sukkot, including chol hamoed, first day, second day, every other day as well. And we do apply it. This is a klal b'chol Torah kula, that mitzvahs that are done through averos are not valid mitzvahs. I steal money for tzedakah, etc. In fact, some even apply it to airplane minyanim. It's a bit questionable. I mentioned this morning that the way you make a minyan in an airplane can sometimes be a chilul Hashem, because you're blocking the bathroom and you're blocking the meal service and the like. So some have even suggested you're not yotzei davening that way, because you're doing your mitzvah by the avera of chilul Hashem. So it is a shas klal, but there are rules, there are conditions to it, so it's a sugi that you need to look at length. Okay, we'll stop here and thank you.